Harlem did not announce its pain loudly in those days. It carried it the way an old man carries winter in his bones, silently, predictably, with a patience that bordered on exhaustion. The streets were alive with motion children darting between, stoopsmen arguing softly over newspapers, women leaning out of windows to call names that echoed like hymns, but beneath that life was an understanding shared by everyone who lived there. Survival required restraint, and dignity was something you defended without drawing attention to yourself. It was a time when the city moved forward by pretending not to notice who it stepped on, and Harlem learned early that being seen too clearly often came at a cost. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than most, not because he spoke of it often, but because he lived as if every step mattered. He walked with calm deliberation, never hurried, never hesitant. A man who had learned that composure could be more disarming than anger. His reputation preceded him, whispered rather than shouted. And yet what most people noticed first was not fear but order. He listened more than he spoke. He watched the way men revealed themselves when they believed no one important was paying attention. In a world that demanded spectacle, Bumpy practiced stillness, and that stillness became its own form of authority. His wife moved through Harlem with a similar grace, though her strength took a different shape. Where Bumpy carried the weight of decisions, she carried the weight of endurance. She knew the cost of being visible and the danger of being underestimated, and she balanced those truths with a quiet intelligence that allowed her to exist without apology. She was not fragile, but she was gentle. Not loud, but unmistakable. When she walked, people noticed not because she demanded it, but because something about her presence slowed the room, reminded it to breathe. She had learned long ago that dignity did not need permission. Their home was modest by design, a deliberate rejection of excess in a neighborhood where too much attention invited the wrong kind of curiosity. Inside, the air was warm, the furniture worn but well cared for, and the silence between conversations felt companionable rather than empty. In the evenings, Bumpy would sit near the window, watching Harlem settle into night, while his wife prepared tea, the quiet rhythm of domestic life grounding them both. They spoke of small things, weather, neighbors, the city's moods, not because larger matters were unimportant, but because they understood that intimacy thrived in the ordinary. It was in those moments that Bumpy seemed most himself, unburdened by expectation, anchored by trust. Yet outside those walls, the city remained unforgiving. Power in New York had a way of pretending it was neutral, while choosing sides all the same, and Harlem often found itself paying for decisions made elsewhere. Trains ran late when they reached certain neighborhoods. Voices hardened when addressing certain faces. Rules bent conveniently for some and snapped rigidly for others. None of it was written down, but everyone understood the pattern. It was a system that thrived on plausible deniability, on the idea that cruelty was accidental rather than intentional, and it demanded silence as the price of survival. Bumpy had crossed paths with this system more times than he cared to count, and each encounter reinforced the same lesson. Outrage was expected, even welcomed, because it made justification easier. Calm, on the other hand, unsettled people. Calm forced them to confront their own behavior without the comfort of reaction. It stripped away the excuse of provocation and left only choice. That was why Bumpy valued restraint, not as weakness, but as strategy, as principle, as a way of insisting on humanity in spaces designed to deny it. His wife understood this instinctively. She had witnessed how easily small indignities accumulated into something corrosive, how humiliation worked not by destroying you outright, but by convincing you to accept less than you deserved. She refused to internalize that message. Each morning, she dressed carefully, not extravagantly, but with intention, as if to say that she mattered even when the world suggested otherwise. She carried herself with quiet confidence, aware that the simple act of standing tall could itself be an act of resistance. On the day that would later be remembered in hushed tones across Harlem, nothing seemed unusual at first. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and the city moved with its usual impatience. Bumpy's wife had errands to run, places to be, obligations that tethered her to the rhythm of the neighborhood. She kissed Bumpy on the cheek before leaving, a gesture so routine it carried no sense of foreboding, and stepped out into the street with the same composed grace she always wore. The subway platform buzzed with low conversation and the metallic echo of approaching trains. People stood close without truly seeing one another, bound together by necessity rather than connection. When the train arrived, doors slid open with a hiss, and the crowd pressed forward, each person carving out a temporary space in a shared enclosure that would soon dissolve again. She found a seat near the middle of the car, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and looked ahead, her expression calm, unreadable to anyone who did not know her. The ride began uneventfully, stations passing in a blur of tiled walls and flickering lights, yet there was a tension beneath the surface, the kind that had nothing to do with noise or movement and everything to do with scrutiny. Eyes lingered a fraction too long. Voices sharpened when addressing certain passengers. Authority, when it appeared, did so selectively, enforcing rules with an enthusiasm that seemed to depend less on necessity than on opportunity. When the conductor approached her, his demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough to be felt. His voice lost its casual tone, becoming clipped, formal, unnecessarily stern. He asked for her ticket, though others nearby went unquestioned. She complied without hesitation, offering it with steady hands and a polite nod. There was no fear in her posture, no defensiveness, only a quiet awareness of what was unfolding. The conductor examined the ticket longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on her face as if searching for justification, for something that would validate the suspicion he had already decided upon. Around them, the car grew quieter. Conversations faded, replaced by the charged silence that always accompanied public humiliation. People stared at the floor, out the windows, anywhere but at the scene unfolding in front of them. It was easier not to notice, easier to tell oneself it was none of their business, easier to survive that way. The conductor's questions became more pointed, his tone edged with something that went beyond procedure. He spoke of rules and compliance, of authority and consequence, each word designed to remind her of her place. She listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago that reacting emotionally only fed the performance, that dignity was maintained not by convincing others of your worth, but by refusing to surrender it. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, not as fear, but as a familiar sadness. This was the price of existing visibly. This was the tax levied on composure. It was then that another presence shifted in the car. A man, older than most of the passengers, rose slowly from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his posture rigid with habit rather than age. There was something unmistakable about him, a quiet gravity that suggested a life shaped by discipline and sacrifice. His face bore the lines of experience, eyes steady, voice calm when he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked why the rules seemed to apply unevenly, why scrutiny found some faces more deserving than others. His words were measured, respectful, yet firm, and they cut through the tension like a blade through cloth. The conductor bristled, taken aback by the challenge, and responded with rehearsed indignation. Invoking authority as if it were both shield and weapon, the veteran did not back down. He spoke of service, of principles fought for abroad and forgotten at home, of dignity, as something that did not evaporate when a uniform was removed. His voice carried the weight of lived conviction, and for a moment, the car held its breath. Passengers glanced up, curiosity and fear warring in their expressions. No one wanted to be involved, yet something about this exchange made disengagement Feel heavier than usual. The conductor's irritation sharpened. He muttered about disruptions and consequences, about calling for assistance if necessary. The threat hung in the air, vague but potent, designed to reassert control through intimidation rather than reason. The veteran remained standing, unflinching, his presence a quiet rebuke. Bumpy's wife sat still, her dignity intact, her eyes forward, refusing to be reduced to a symbol or a spectacle. Unbeknownst to them, the city was already leaning toward a turning point. At the next station, the doors opened, and the familiar rhythm of passengers entering and exiting resumed. Among them stepped Bumpy Johnson, his arrival unannounced yet immediately felt. He did not rush. He did not scan the car for trouble. He simply entered, taking in the scene with a calm that suggested both awareness and restraint. His eyes met his wife's briefly, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. And then he turned his attention to the conductor. Bumpy did not speak right away. He allowed the moment to breathe, the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. In that pause, the power dynamics shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The conductor sensed it before he understood it, the way animals sense a change in weather. Authority, when confronted with calm certainty, often reveals its fragility, and the car seemed to recognize this truth collectively. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying no threat and no apology. He addressed the situation not as a confrontation, but as a clarification. He spoke of respect, of the way public spaces reflected the values of the city that built them, of how small moments carried long shadows. His words were few, chosen carefully. He simply named the moral reality of what was happening and allowed it to stand on its own. The conductor faltered, replaced by an awareness of witnesses, of accountability, of the possibility that this moment would not disappear quietly. He cleared his throat, muttered something about procedure, and moved on, his authority diminished not by force, but by exposure. The car remained silent as the train lurched forward, the tension slowly dissipating into something heavier, more reflective. The veteran returned to his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening with something that looked suspiciously like relief. Bumpy's wife adjusted her posture slightly, a small act of reclamation, and allowed herself a quiet breath. Around them, passengers shifted, some wiping at their eyes, others staring at nothing in particular. Harlem carried the moment with it, though no one spoke of it aloud. This was how stories began there, not with declarations, but with shared understanding. To file away the lesson in its collective consciousness. Dignity, it seemed, had found its voice not in noise or spectacle, or how deeply the city would feel there. Impact in the days to come, one truth had been quietly reaffirmed. Justice did not always arrive with force. Could be the loudest statement of all. Harlem remembered what happened on that subway, but it didn't remember. It wasn't a headline in bold ink or a story traded for coins at a corner stand. It was something quieter, more dangerous in its own way, a truth passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer that didn't need permission to be spoken. Without raising his voice, and that was what made it feel unreal to some and sacred to others. To brace, the idea that dignity could be restored with a few calm words felt like a miracle. And attention, especially the wrong kind, always sent a bill. The very next week, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. The streets looked the same. The storefronts opened at the Payuhuang. Same hours, and children still ran like sunlight between stoops. But certain doors closed faster when footsteps approached. Even the air felt more cautious, as if Harlem had leaned too far into hope and now needed to correct itself for safety. It had embarrassed a system that thrived on humiliation as routine. Systems did not forgive being exposed. Bumpy felt it before anyone said it out loud. He was sitting by the window, watching the neighborhood settle into the dim gold of streetlights, when a car he didn't recognize rolled slowly past their block. The driver didn't look up, didn't need to. He didn't blink harder or tense his jaw the way men did when they wanted to look ready. He simply watched the car until it left, then turned his attention back to his wife as if nothing had happened. There would be consequences, not because. Still steady carried the aftershock in a way only a woman could. The way a storm can be heard in the distance, even when the sky above you looks clear. She continued her days as usual, not out of denial, but out of principle. She refused to let fear reorganize her life. Yet small things began happening that were too deliberate to ignore. A store clerk who had always greeted her warmly suddenly addressed her with forced politeness, eyes darting away as if afraid of being seen offering kindness. A neighbor who normally chatted by the stairwell gave only a nod and hurried inside. And once, when she stepped onto the same subway line again, just positioned like punctuation at the end of a sentence, that night, Bumpy placed a cup of tea in front of her and asked gently if anything felt different. Understood that safety was sometimes made of small details. She met his eyes and told him the truth in a quiet voice. The city was watching. Harlem was listening. And somewhere beyond both, someone was waiting. Bumpy nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. He did not become angry. Anger was too easy. More present. The next morning, he walked Harlem like he owned nothing but responsibility, stopping to speak with shopkeepers, leaning close to elderly men on stoops, listening to rumors the way a doctor listens to a pulse. He heard the same phrase again and again, whispered with different faces but identical fear. They didn't like that on the train. In Harlem was rarely a single person. It was a cloud. A machine. A hunger. The first real sign of escalation arrived not as violence. A sealed envelope was delivered to Bumpy's home in the late afternoon. His wife picked it up, feeling its weight as if it contained more than ink. She didn't open it. She handed it to him with the same calm she used when passing a cup of tea, but her eyes held the question she wouldn't speak. Bumpy opened it at the table, slowly, as if refusing to be rushed by intimidation. Just a message printed in neat letters. A conversation would benefit everyone. His wife watched his face for reaction, but Bumpy's expression remained composed, almost bored. She asked. Bumpy lifted his eyes to hers. "I will," he said, "but not the way they expect." The address led to a place that didn't belong to Harlem. It was one of those downtown rooms where everything smelled like expensive smoke and decisions that never touched the ground. The kind of place where men spoke softly, because they believed they controlled the noise of the world. When Bumpy arrived, he was met with forced courtesy smiles that didn't reach eyes, handshakes that felt like measuring tape. A man escorted him through a corridor and into a private lounge where a handful of figures waited. Seated like judges out at the center sat a man with a face that looked carved out of cold stone. His posture relaxed in the way of someone who believed relaxation itself was a signal of dominance. He was dressed well too well like money that wanted to be admired. He didn't stand when Bumpy entered. He didn't need to. The room was designed to remind visitors who held power without ever saying it. The man gestured to a chair across from him. Bumpy sat without hesitation, without apology, and for a moment, they studied each other in silence. Around them, the others waited like shadows, expecting sparks, expecting ego, expecting a show. But Bumpy gave them none. He sat as if he had all night. Finally, the man spoke. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. "You made a scene." Bumpy's eyes remained steady. "No," he said softly. "I stopped one." The room tightened. The man's smile thinned. "The city doesn't like disruptions," he said. "People get nervous. Things get complicated." Bumpy leaned back slightly. "The city gets complicated when it forgets its manners," he replied, his voice calm, almost gentle. "My wife was treated unfairly in front of strangers. A veteran stood up for her. I reminded someone to act like a human being. That should not complicate anything." The man chuckled as if amused, but the sound was hollow. You're not naive, Bumpy. You know what that train was. You know what it represents. Some rules exist for a reason. Bumpy's gaze did not flicker. Rules that require humiliation to function are not rules, he said. They're habits. A pause stretched. The air seemed to thicken with unsaid threats. The man tapped his fingers on the armrest, then leaned forward, voice lower now. What do you want? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He let the question sit, because he understood something these men often forgot. Desperation belonged to the powerless. Bumpy did not beg for dignity. He expected it. What I want, Bumpy said finally, is for my wife to ride the train without being singled out. For veterans to speak without being threatened. For Harlem to breathe without someone tightening a leash. The man's eyes narrowed. That's not how things work, he said. Bumpy nodded once, almost sympathetically. Then that's why we're here, he said. The conversation ended the way most conversations with power ended. Not with agreement, but with warning disguised as advice. The man's tone softened, as if concerned. You have influence, he said. Don't misuse it. Don't make the wrong people uncomfortable. It creates consequences. Bumpy stood slowly, adjusting his coat with calm precision. Consequences happen when people decide to do wrong, he said. Not when someone decides to do right. He left the room without looking back. But the moment he stepped outside into the cold night air, he felt it, the shift, the invisible hand tightening, the silent decision being made somewhere behind. Curtains. 2 days later, the consequences arrived. It started in Harlem, as these things always did, with whispers and closed doors. A local shopkeeper, an older man who had known Bumpy since he was young, was suddenly accused of operating without the proper licenses. Inspectors came like a swarm, measuring tape and clipboards in hand, shutting the place down with the smug efficiency of people who enjoyed enforcing rules they didn't respect. The shopkeeper's hands shook as he held his paperwork, voice cracking as he tried to reason. He wasn't a criminal. He was a man who sold bread and milk. But the system treated him like a threat, because he belonged to Harlem and because he had once nodded respectfully when Bumpy walked by. Then a church fundraiser was denied its permit. Then a housing request disappeared into bureaucratic fog. Then a young man was pulled off the street and searched with unnecessary roughness, just to remind everyone watching that authority could touch anyone it wanted. The injustice was not explosive, it was systematic. A slow squeeze designed to make Harlem turn inward, to make people resent the man whose quiet moral act had triggered the reaction. Bumpy watched it unfold with the patience of a man studying a chessboard. He didn't panic. He didn't retaliate. He understood the strategy. Isolate him. Make him look like the cause of suffering. Force the community to choose between dignity and safety. It was an old tactic. It had broken stronger people than him. But Bumpy had something the system didn't expect. Restraint rooted in principle. And a wife who refused to let fear turn her into a quieter version of herself. Still, even she felt the pressure now. One afternoon, as she returned home with groceries, she noticed a policeman standing near their building entrance. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't blocking her path. But his gaze followed her with a deliberate slowness, a message delivered without words. We can watch you all day and call it our job. She kept walking. She did not lower her eyes. She did not quicken her pace. She entered her building with dignity, intact, but when she closed the apartment door behind her, she leaned against it for a moment longer than usual, breathing slowly, letting the steadiness return to her bones. When Bumpy arrived home later and saw the faint tension in her shoulders, he didn't ask what happened. He simply took her hand and held it as if he were reminding the world and her that she was not alone. That night, Bumpy received another message. This one wasn't on elegant paper. It was delivered through a frightened young boy who lived down the street. The boy knocked on the door with trembling fingers, eyes wide, holding a small folded note. Bumpy took it gently, thanked him, and gave him a coin not as payment, but as kindness. When the boy ran off, Bumpy opened the note and read it without change of expression. The message was short. "You can't protect everyone." His wife saw the note in his hand and understood immediately. "They're trying to make you choose," she said quietly. Bumpy folded the note and placed it on the table. "They're trying to make Harlem choose," he corrected. She stepped closer. "And what will you do?" Bumpy looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes there was no panic, no anger, only resolve. "I will do what I always do," he said. "I will remind them that Harlem is not a leash, it's a heart." The next day, Bumpy began moving differently, not with aggression, but with intention. He visited the shopkeeper whose store had been shut down, sitting with him in the dim light of his now closed shop, listening to his fears, his shame, his anger. Bumpy did not promise revenge. He promised restoration. He visited the church pastor, standing quietly in the sanctuary as the pastor spoke of permits denied and donations stalled. Bumpy listened, then nodded as if filing away each injustice. Like a ledger, Harlem watched him move from place to place and felt something stir beneath the fear, a sense that someone was paying attention, but the opposition was not idle. That evening, as Bumpy's wife attended a small community gathering, a modest meeting meant to discuss neighborhood needs, two strangers appeared at the back of the room. They were dressed like working men, but their stillness didn't belong. They leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning faces, not listening to the meeting at all. Their presence drained the warmth from the room like a draft. People's voices softened, conversations shortened. The meeting ended early with forced smiles and polite excuses. As Bumpy's wife stepped outside into the cool air, she felt the familiar sensation of being watched again. One of the strangers lit a cigarette slowly, the flame briefly illuminating his eyes, and he said, almost casually, "Tell your husband he's making things hard for people." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were designed to be carried home like poison. She did not respond. She simply looked at him for a moment, steady, calm, unafraid, and then walked away with her head high. But inside her chest, the tension tightened. Not because she feared for herself, but because she understood the weight of responsibility being placed on Bumpy's shoulders. The cruel attempt to turn community pressure into a weapon. When she told Bumpy what had been said, he listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once. "They're getting impatient," he said. "Is that dangerous?" She asked. Bumpy's eyes met hers. "It means we're close," he said quietly. That night, Harlem experienced the kind of silence that comes before storms. Windows closed early, doors locked with extra care. Even the music that usually drifted out of apartments seemed quieter, as if the neighborhood itself was trying not to be heard. Bumpy sat at the table, hands folded, thinking. His wife sat across from him, her presence steady. They did not need to fill the space with words. They understood each other in the way people do when they've survived too much together. Finally, Bumpy spoke softly, as if speaking too loudly might insult the seriousness of what he was about to say. "They're not after me," he said. "Not truly." His wife's brow tightened. "Then what are they after?" Bumpy's voice remained calm. "They're after the idea that a woman can be humiliated and the car can stay quiet," he said. "They're after the idea that a veteran can speak and be threatened into silence. They're after the idea that Harlem must always accept what it's given." His wife swallowed, the weight of that truth pressing down. "And how do you stop an idea?" she asked. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "You replace it," he said, "with a stronger one." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the streetlights. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will take the train." His wife's eyes widened slightly, but she did not argue. "With me?" she asked. Bumpy turned back to her. "Yes," he said. "Not to provoke, not to perform, but to remind them and everyone watching that dignity is not a private matter. It's a public standard." Outside, the city continued to breathe, unaware that a quiet confrontation was being prepared, not with fists, not with weapons, not with threats, but with presence. The system was ready to punish. Harlem was ready to retreat. And in the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson, composed, intelligent, respectful, quietly authoritative, was preparing to do something that would make the city's cruelty visible again. Not for spectacle, but for justice. Because if they wanted to make an example out of Harlem, Bumpy intended to make an example out of dignity. And the next morning, as the sun rose pale over the rooftops, Harlem began to sense that something was about to change, something irreversible, something that would either break them into silence or lift them back into themselves. The morning arrived without ceremony, which was how moments of consequence often announce themselves. Harlem woke the way it always did, with the low hum of life resuming its rhythms. But there was a restraint in the air that hadn't been there before. A subtle tension that pressed against the chest like an unspoken question. People stepped out of their buildings and paused just a second longer than usual, scanning the street as if expecting to see something written in the light itself. Word had traveled, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. Bumpy Johnson was going to take the train. And this time, he was not going alone. For the system that had grown comfortable operating in shadows, this was unsettling. Power preferred darkness. Because darkness allowed it to deny its own shape. It thrived on isolation, on moments that could be dismissed as misunderstandings or coincidences. But Bumpy's decision threatened to do something far more dangerous than confrontation. It threatened to make injustice visible in daylight, witnessed by ordinary people who would have to reckon with what they saw. Bumpy and his wife left their apartment side by side, their movements unhurried, their posture composed. She wore a simple coat, her hair neatly arranged, her expression calm but resolute. He walked with the same deliberate steadiness he always had, neither shielding her nor placing himself ahead of her, but matching her stride as an equal. To anyone watching from a distance, they might have looked like any other couple beginning an ordinary day. Only those who knew the stakes understood how extraordinary that ordinariness was. As they moved through Harlem, small signs began to appear. A shopkeeper stepped outside and nodded, not with fear this time, but with something closer to hope. A woman sweeping her stoop paused and watched them pass, her broom held still as if movement might break the moment. Even the children, sensing something serious without understanding it, grew quieter, eyes following Bumpy and his wife with a curiosity that felt almost reverent. Harlem was not cheering. It was witnessing. The subway entrance loomed ahead like a threshold rather than a destination. Down below, the tunnels carried more than trains. They carried the habits of a city that had learned to move people without seeing them. As Bumpy and his wife descended the stairs, the noise of the street faded, replaced by the metallic echoes and distant rumble that belonged to a world entirely. Posters peeled from the walls, advertisements promising progress to people who had long stopped believing in it. The platform was already crowded, the air thick with bodies and anticipation. They waited together without speaking. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been understood. When the train arrived, its doors opened with a familiar hiss, and the crowd surged forward. Bumpy and his wife stepped inside, finding space near the center of the car. They did not sit. They stood, visible without being theatrical, present without demanding attention. The doors closed, and the train lurched forward, carrying them deeper into the city's veins. At first, nothing happened. Stations passed. People shifted. Conversations rose and fell. The absence of conflict began to feel almost oppressive, like the stillness before a thunderclap. Bumpy remained calm, his gaze steady, occasionally meeting his wife's eyes with a quiet reassurance. She stood tall, Her hands relaxed at her sides, her composure unbroken. For a moment, it seemed possible that the system would retreat, that it would choose discretion over exposure, but power, once challenged, rarely resists the urge to reassert itself. At the third stop, two uniformed officials entered the car. Their presence altered the atmosphere immediately, the way a sudden drop in temperature changes the feel of a room. They moved with purpose, scanning faces, their authority worn like armor. Passengers stiffened, some instinctively checking pockets, others staring at the floor. The officials began their inspection, moving methodically, asking for tickets with a tone that oscillated between boredom and disdain. When they reached Bumpy and his wife, the shift was unmistakable. Their questions became sharper, their scrutiny heavier. One of the officials held her ticket longer than necessary, his eyes flicking from the paper to her face, as if searching for justification where none existed. The other stood slightly closer than needed, his posture invasive without being overtly aggressive. Around them, the car fell into a familiar hush, the kind that followed injustice like a shadow. Bumpy did not intervene immediately. He waited. This was intentional. He understood that timing mattered, that words spoken too soon could be dismissed as impatience, while words spoken too late could be framed as escalation. He allowed the moment to unfold, just enough for its cruelty to be unmistakable, just enough for the witnesses to feel the discomfort settle into their bones. His wife remained composed, her expression calm, her dignity intact. She answered questions without apology, without defensiveness. She did not shrink. She did not perform. She simply existed, fully and unapologetically, and that more than anything seemed to irritate the officials. One of them finally spoke. His voice edged with irritation. "You're going to have to come with us at the next stop," he said, his tone suggesting procedure while implying punishment. A ripple of tension moved through the car. People shifted in their seats. Someone inhaled sharply. This was the moment the system counted on, the moment when fear would isolate its target, when silence would rush in to fill the space where solidarity might have lived. Bumpy stepped forward. Then, just enough to be heard, not enough to be accused of obstruction. His voice was low, steady, carrying without effort. "On what grounds?" he asked. The official turned toward him, surprise flashing briefly across his face before being replaced by practiced authority. "This doesn't concern you," he said. Bumpy met his gaze without challenge, without submission. "It concerns me," he replied calmly, "because you are addressing my wife." The word wife landed in the car like a dropped coin, sharp and clear. It reframed the scene instantly, transforming a faceless target into a person with connection, with context, with someone willing to stand beside her publicly. The official hesitated, then scoffed. "We're just doing our job," he said. Bumpy nodded slightly. "Then you won't mind explaining it," he said. Out loud, for everyone. Silence spread. The request was simple, almost polite, but it was devastating in its implication. Explanation required accountability. Accountability required clarity. And clarity was the enemy of arbitrary power. The official bristled. "We don't owe explanations," he snapped. Bumpy's expression did not change. "When authority singles out a citizen in a public space," he said evenly, "it owes everyone an explanation. Otherwise, it's not authority, it's harassment." The words were not shouted. They did not accuse. They simply named what was happening. And in naming it, they stripped it of its disguise. Passengers began to look up. Eyes met eyes. The silence shifted from fear to attention. A man near the door straightened his posture. A woman across the aisle tightened her grip on her bag, her jaw set. Even those who said nothing felt something stirring, a recognition that this moment belonged to all of them, not just the couple at its center. The second official cleared his throat, sensing the change. "Let's move on," he muttered to his partner, his voice suddenly less certain. The first official hesitated. his authority wobbling under the weight of too many witnesses. Finally, he handed the ticket back with a sharp motion. "Watch yourselves," he said, the threat thin and unconvincing now. The officials moved on, their presence diminished, their power exposed not by force but by scrutiny. The train resumed its rhythm, the tension slowly releasing like a held breath. But the moment did not dissolve into forgetfulness. It lingered, heavy and resonant. Bumpy stepped back beside his wife. He did not touch her immediately. He waited until the car's attention drifted, until the danger of spectacle passed. Then he placed his hand lightly over hers, a gesture of solidarity so quiet it felt sacred. She squeezed his hand once, a silent acknowledgement, her eyes shining not with fear, but with something closer to relief. Yet the system was not finished. At the next station, the train stopped longer than usual. Doors remained closed, murmurs spread. An announcement crackled over the speaker, vague and unhelpful, citing delays. Bumpy felt it then, the escalation. This was not about procedure anymore. This was about control. Through the window, he saw movement on the platform. More officials, more uniforms. Too many for coincidence. The message was clear. Compliance had been requested politely. Now it would be enforced through pressure. The car grew tense again, the earlier courage threatened by the looming presence of force. People avoided looking at Bumpy and his wife, not out of rejection, but out of fear of being implicated. The system was counting on that fear to do what it always did: isolate, intimidate, neutralize. Bumpy leaned slightly toward his wife. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "you stay calm." She nodded, her expression steady. "I know," she replied. When the doors finally opened, officials boarded en masse, their boots echoing like punctuation marks in a sentence meant to end the conversation. The lead officer stepped forward, his face stern, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "We need you both to step off the train," he said. Bumpy did not move, neither did his wife. He looked at the officer calmly. "For what reason?" he asked. The officer's jaw tightened. "You're causing a disturbance." Bumpy gestured gently to the car around them. "The only disturbance here," he said, "is the one you brought with you." The officer's eyes flicked to the watching passengers, irritation flashing. "This is your last warning," he said. Bumpy inhaled slowly, then spoke words that would echo far beyond the walls of that train car. "If you remove us," he said evenly, "you do it knowing that every person here will remember why. Not what you write in a report, not what you tell your supervisors. They will remember what they saw." The officer hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the realization that this was no longer a private exercise of power, but a public test of legitimacy. Around them, passengers watched in complete silence, their stillness louder than any protest could have been. Then, from the back of the car, a voice spoke. It was not angry, it was not loud. It was the voice of an older woman, steady and clear. "He's right," she said. "We saw everything." Another voice followed. Then another. Not shouting, not chanting. Simply acknowledging, witnessing. The system, faced with the one thing it feared most, collective awareness, began to retreat. The lead officer exhaled sharply, his authority slipping through his fingers. "Let's go," he muttered to his team. The officials disembarked, the doors closed, and the train pulled away, carrying with it a moment that would not be forgotten. Inside the car, no one spoke. Some people wiped their eyes. Others stared straight ahead, as if committing the scene to memory. Bumpy stood with his wife, their hands still joined, their presence unchanged. They had not won a battle in the traditional sense. They had done something far more enduring. They had made injustice undeniable. As the train continued its journey, Harlem felt it too, even from a distance. Something had shifted. Not because power had been overthrown, but because fear had been interrupted. The city had held its breath, and for once, it had not exhaled in surrender. What came next would be heavier, more dangerous, more consequential, because the system did not forget being challenged in public. And Bumpy Johnson knew, as the train carried them forward, that the final reckoning would not come on a subway car. It would come in the open. And when it did, Harlem would have to decide whether it would return to silence or stand fully awake. The city did not respond immediately to what happened on that train, and that delay was the most dangerous part. In New York, silence after a public reckoning was never peace. It was calculation. Harlem felt it as a pressure behind the eyes, a weighting that crept into conversations and lingered at the edges of sleep. People went about their days, but they did so with a heightened awareness, as if the streets themselves were listening. The system that had been exposed did not rage or retaliate openly. It withdrew, reassessed, and prepared to remind everyone who it believed still held control. Bumpy Johnson understood this instinctively. He had not embarrassed a few officials. He had challenged a ritual of quiet cruelty that relied on invisibility. To survive, systems did not forgive that. They adapted. And adaptation, in this case, meant choosing a battleground where power could appear orderly while doing its damage with clean hands. The reckoning would not come with sirens or fists. It would come with paperwork, closed doors, and carefully worded accusations that sounded reasonable to people who had never been humiliated in public. The first move came 3 days later, when notices began appearing across Harlem. Permits were being reviewed. Leases were being reassessed. Community gatherings were postponed indefinitely due to administrative concerns. Each notice taken alone could be dismissed as coincidence. Together, they formed a pattern as unmistakable as fingerprints. The message was clear. If you disrupted the system's comfort, the system would disrupt your survival. Harlem felt the squeeze immediately. A food pantry run by church volunteers was suddenly cited for violations it had never been warned about. A neighborhood hall that hosted meetings for veterans was told its insurance paperwork was insufficient. These were not random targets. They were places where people gathered, spoke, remembered who they were. The system wasn't punishing Bumpy directly. It was teaching Harlem a lesson using its most vulnerable arteries. Bumpy watched it unfold without panic, but not without weight. Each closure, each delay, landed on him like a quiet accusation. People did not confront him. That would have required courage they could not afford. Instead, they avoided his eyes a little longer, spoken hushed. Tones wondered silently whether dignity was worth the cost being demanded. This was the strategy. Make justice feel expensive. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Bumpy's wife noticed it in the way knocks on the door came later at night, more hesitant, more fearful. She noticed it in the way neighbors' voices dropped when they passed in the hall, not out of resentment, but out of anxiety. She carried these observations with her quietly, the way she carried everything else, with grace and restraint. But one evening, as they sat together after dinner, she finally spoke. "They're trying to turn you into a burden," she said softly. Bumpy nodded. "They want people to associate dignity with loss," he replied. "That way, silence starts to look like relief." She studied him, searching his face not for doubt, but for fatigue. "And what happens if Harlem decides it can't afford to be brave?" Bumpy met her gaze. "Then I remind them that silence has a cost too," he said. "It just hides the bill." The next morning, Bumpy did something unexpected. He did not call meetings. He did not send messages. He did not issue instructions. Instead, he walked Harlem alone, without announcement, without entourage, without performance. He visited the closed pantry and spoke with the volunteers, not as a leader issuing promises, but as a man listening. He sat with the pastor whose hall had been shuttered and let him talk through his anger, his fear, his doubt. Bumpy did not interrupt. He did not reassure prematurely. He allowed the truth to breathe. By afternoon, word began to spread, not because Bumpy intended it to, but because Harlem recognized sincerity when it saw it. He wasn't rallying people. He wasn't calling for resistance. He was acknowledging pain without exploiting it. And that, in a neighborhood used to being spoken about rather than spoken with, mattered more than speeches ever could. That evening, Bumpy received another invitation. This one was not polite. It was not elegant. It came through a mutual acquaintance, whose hands shook as he delivered the message. "They want to meet," the man said. "Tonight. They say it's urgent." Bumpy thanked him and sent him home with a quiet reassurance. When the door closed, his wife looked at him steadily. "This is it," she said. Bumpy adjusted his coat. "Yes," he replied. "This is where they decide whether dignity is worth conceding or crushing." The meeting took place in a municipal building that prided itself on neutrality. Everything inside was beige and polished, designed to feel reasonable. Bumpy was led into a conference room where several officials sat behind a long table, their expressions carefully composed. There were no gangsters here, no threats disguised as smiles. This was authority in its cleanest costume. One of the men cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his tone measured, "recent events have created tension." Bumpy took a seat without being invited. "Tension existed long before recent events," he said calmly. "It just wasn't acknowledged." Another official leaned forward. "Your actions have led to disruptions across the community," she said. "People are suffering." Bumpy nodded once. "They were suffering before," he replied. "Now it's visible." A murmur rippled through the table. The first man spoke again. "You have influence," he said carefully. "You could calm things down, encourage cooperation, help restore normalcy." Bumpy's eyes did not waver. "Normalcy," he repeated. "For whom?" Silence followed. Papers rustled. A pen tapped nervously against wood. "We're prepared to make certain accommodations," the woman said. "Permits reinstated. Reviews expedited, provided that tensions are eased." Bumpy leaned back slightly. "You're offering to stop harming people," he said, "if I help you pretend nothing was wrong." "That's not what we're saying," the first man protested. "It is," Bumpy replied gently. "You're asking me to sell silence." The words landed hard, stripping the room of its bureaucratic language. For a moment, the officials looked less like authority and more like people caught without a script. "What do you want?" the woman asked finally. Bumpy considered the question carefully. He did not rush. This was the moment that would define everything. "I want policy," he said, "not favors. Clear standards for conduct on public transit. Accountability when those standards are violated. Training that treats dignity as non-negotiable, not optional." "That's unrealistic," someone said. "That sets precedent." Bumpy's voice remained calm. "So does injustice," he said. "You've just been comfortable with that precedent." The officials exchanged glances. This was not a negotiation they had anticipated. They had expected threats, demands, perhaps even violence. They had not expected moral clarity delivered without spectacle. "And if we refuse?" the first man asked. Bumpy stood slowly. "Then Harlem will continue to see exactly what you're willing to do to avoid accountability," he said. "And they will remember." The room fell silent, not hostile, not explosive, just heavy with consequence. 2 days passed without response. Harlem waited, suspended between fear and hope. On the third morning, something extraordinary happened, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Notices appeared announcing the immediate reopening of community spaces, the pantry doors unlocked, the hall permit reinstated. Transit authorities released a public statement outlining new conduct standards and review procedures. No apology was issued by name, but the acknowledgement was there, unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read it. Harlem did not celebrate. It absorbed. On the subway that evening, something felt different. Officials moved through cars with quieter posture. Voices softened. Eye contact lingered longer. No one announced the change, but everyone felt it. Dignity, once disrupted, had been deliberately restored. Bumpy and his wife rode that train together again. This time, they sat. No scrutiny came. No tension followed. They were simply passengers, equal among equals. Across the car, an older man caught Bumpy's eye and nodded, not with fear, not with obligation, but with gratitude. A woman held her child a little closer, her shoulders relaxing as if she'd been holding something too long. When they returned home, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of relief. Windows glowed softly. Conversations drifted gently through open air. Harlem was not loud because it did not need to be. It had been heard. Later that night, Bumpy stood by the window as he always did, watching the street settle into itself. His wife joined him, resting her hand on his arm. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally she said, "They cried." He looked at her. "Who?" he asked. "The city," she replied softly. It cried without making a sound. Bumpy nodded, understanding. Justice, when it came without violence, often sounded like silence returning to its proper place. What Harlem remembered in the days that followed was not the official's retreat or the reopened doors. It remembered the way dignity had been defended. Without cruelty, authority challenged without chaos, fear interrupted without bloodshed. It remembered that a woman had refused to be humiliated, that a veteran had refused to sit, and that a man named Bumpy Johnson had refused to trade silence for comfort. For 3 days, people spoke of it in whispers. On the 4th, they stopped speaking at all. They didn't need to. The city had learned something it would never unlearn, and Harlem, once again, stood taller not because it had won a war, but because it had kept its soul.